in the previous iteration or phase of What's This Tao All About, we talked a lot about the Tao Te Ching and the works of Lao Tzu, and we went through just about, I believe, all 81 chapters of the book. So it was a natural point here where, look, there's the second most important book in the Taoist canon, the works of Chuang Tzu. And so I figured, why not start there? I figured that would be a great place to start off. And George, you recommended a book to me, a Burton Watson translation of his work. And for people, just to give people a little brief once over of what Chuang Tzu's work means, the Taoist canon, I highlighted this little part of the book. So if you can indulge me for a moment, I'm going to read it. But it talks about Chuang Tzu's real specific perspective on the Tao. The central theme of the Chuang Tzu may be summed up in a single word: freedom. Essentially, all the philosophers of ancient China addressed themselves to the same problem. How is man to live in a world dominated by chaos, suffering, and absurdity? Nearly all of them answered with some concrete plan of action designed to reform the individual, to reform society, and eventually to free the world from its ills. The proposals put together by the Confucians, the Mohists, and the legalists, and these are three different kind of competing and slightly collaborative different Chinese philosophical schools. They were all different, but all based upon the same kind of common sense approach to the problem, and all seek for concrete social, political, and ethical forms to solve it. Chuang Tzu's answer, however, the answer of one branch of the Taoist school, is radically different from these, and is grounded upon a wholly different type of thinking. Its answer it is the answer of a mystic, and attempting to describe here in clear and concrete language, I shall undoubtedly be doing violence to its essentially mystic and indescribable nature. But Chuang Tzu's answer to the question is, free yourself from the world. And what does he mean by this? In a section not translated here, he tells the story of someone who went to visit the Taoist sage Lao Tzu. And when he appeared, Lao Tzu asked, why did you come with this whole crowd of people? And the man whirled around and didn't notice anyone behind him. And needless to say, they weren't there. There wasn't anybody there. It was just the man. But he came with a baggage of old ideas, the conventional concepts of right and wrong, good and bad, life and death, that he lugged with him wherever he went. And that's just how pretty much all of we are, unless you are an enlightened sage. You come with all this whole baggage of junk that we accumulate, like before you used to have to defrag your computer, and it's we have all that. And so Chuang Tzu is talking about liberating everybody from all that and getting to a more pure sense of being. And one little point, Chuang Tzu employs every resource of his rhetoric and his efforts to awaken the reader to the essential meaninglessness of conventional values and free him or herself from their bondage.
So beautiful. And yeah, Zhuangzi has been really, really inspiring on my journey. And yeah, we've got the Tao Te Ching, the foundational text of Taoism, and Zhuangzi being the second foundational text. And what I love about Zhuangzi is he's so funny. He's irreverent, and his heroes and holders of wisdom are talking trees and benevolent bandits and the spirits of huge oaks and trees that somehow have deep wisdom that appear in dreams, and it's all mystical and wonderful, and yet really, really deep. And for me, it is that teachings of a mystic, someone who points to the fact that the words and the books, they are useful, but at some point we've got to let them go, and we've got to find an intuitive, embodied understanding of ourselves and the world. And Zhuangzi's stories, for me, have helped me break out of the sort of Western logical domination of thinking right and wrong and putting everything in their boxes. And yeah, it's been really powerful in my life.
I often think that like Taoist teachings is like the antidote to the Western mind. And And that's not to say that Western thinking is bad or
Yeah,
inferior, but we need something to balance that out, right? And
yeah.
especially him speaking about how all the different baggage that we bring with us into our everyday interactions with people, and our, and the world and nature and my dog Archie, all that baggage we bring, much of it is unnecessary, and so he
Yeah.
wants to liberate everybody. And I think when I first came across Taoist philosophy when I was 20 years old, I think the big thing was this feeling of liberation and freedom from all the kind of dogmatic things I had been raised in. And it was like, oh, wait a minute, I can look at things morally in much less prescriptive ways. I can feel like I can live freely, think freely, and do all that with also trying to be a person who has a bit of virtue, not too much virtue, because we don't be too virtuous. We gotta have balance. You have to have a little bit of rascal in you, right? Um,
That's it.
uh,
And we can still live with integrity and show up in the world in a way that is harmonious and maybe what people would label as good, but just not because we're trying to fulfill these labels and ideas of who we should be, but instead it comes from a deep, authentic place of understanding how to navigate our lives. And so then with that understanding comes that freedom where we don't then need to just fit into how our families say we should be, our society tells us we should be. And with that, we find ourselves and our ability to enjoy the here and now.
so let's go over in the Thomas Merton translation of the Chuang Tzu, the works of Chuang Tzu. He has a passage, I guess we'll call it a chapter, where he talks about the quote, man of Tao. And, obviously, person of Tao, female of Tao, he talks about that. So it gives kind of if we're going to get into Chuang Tzu, it's nice to have a once over of what's our goal? What are we aiming towards? Who are we trying to be? And this world, as Watson said, that's full of chaos and absurdity. And, I did something the other day. I was watching the news. A lot of chaos and absurdity out there. It was.
An awful lot, yeah.
I don't know if anybody out there has been watching the news, but a lot of chaos and absurdity happening.
Yeah, you've got to watch that dose of absurdity. It can get too much.
That's right. That's right. What was it the other day? It was funny because one of my problems is I love Twitter. I love to scroll through Twitter, and I'm getting better. I deleted the app from my phone, but I will. It's necessary when you create things and everything to have it, and so I'll just go on my desktop, But I did find someone say, "Why in the world would I be on Twitter and just look at a bunch of screaming rageaholics all day?" And I'm like, "Yeah, geez, why? What's the benefit to that?" So in here we have this quick chapter called Man of Tao that we can go over and kind of break down, and I'll
Great.
help each other understand it.
Beautiful.
And again, this is the Merton translation. Now, George, do you have any thoughts on the Merton translation versus, as you recommended, the Watson, or all the different views, or where the Merton translation sits in the overall Chuang Tzu canon?
Yeah, so with any texts from China, from even any text that requires a translation, there is a lot of power put in the translator as to what they believe the intention and the meaning of that original author was, and then what words to select in English. And so, in the same way with the Tao Te Ching, it's good to get many different copies, and then for you to intuit firstly what you really need from that text and from that chapter, because there is a lot of flexibility in the understanding. And then with that triangulation, or even for the Tao Te Ching, I have maybe 10 copies, 10 different interpretations that I use to then try and get closer to at least maybe where the original meaning of Lao Tzu was. Zhuangzi is the same, and there's many different versions. So the one that we're going to explore today with Thomas Merton condenses these stories into kind of poems, and they're shorter, and Thomas Merton has interpreted them, and so it's not the original text. Burton Watson does a translation which is closer to the original. If you go to the whole works of Zhuangzi, it's like 600 pages, 500 pages. So, it's a big old investment of time, but there's a lot of depth there. one other copy I'd really recommend for you is CC Tsai's comic book retelling of this.
Oh.
So the book's called The Way of Nature by CC Tsai, and it's stunning, so fun. And it, in pictogram form, represents all these amazing characters that came out of Zhuangzi's head and makes it really accessible. So generally, my approach, so like I love to share Zhuangzi stories in my sessions, and my basic process of doing that is I start with the CC Tsai picture book, because it's just a nice way to see, oh, okay, this story resonates. And then I will then do that triangulation process. So I'll read the Thomas Merton, I'd read the Berta Motzen, and then read it all and then speak it out and make it my own. And really that's, as we'll, through all the episodes we do, the words from me and Todd and from Zhuangzi and from Lao Tzu and whatever words are communicated in this podcast are for you to enjoy and to imbibe and to take in, but then really the wisdom develops when you make it your own and it turns into your own words. And I always like to invite as a practice is, can you go for a walk in nature and just speak out some of these ideas that you've been learning? Because I always surprise myself. It's that, I prepare a session and I think I've understood this. And then I go for a walk and try and speak it out in my own words without notes. And I realize, holy smokes, I know nothing. And it's only then when I start to speak it out that really then it becomes my own understanding as opposed to somebody else's words.
I love that idea of speaking it out. I find that I often learn a lot about what I'm by talking it out just on the show or practicing in my head maybe what I'm going to talk about before. The funny thing is, and this always happens 100% of the time, if I go back and listen to maybe like an old show of this podcast, I'll listen back to it and I'll go, oh Lord, I totally missed something there. Like there was a big chunk of information that I didn't even get. Like my brain was not ready for that information. And years later, you look at me, oh Lord, oh boy. And then also, and vice versa, like I'll go, I wouldn't have taken that from that now. And I think that's more correct back then. So Lordy, who knows?
Beautiful. And that's because we always, what stands out in terms of the meaning, if we read the Tao Te Ching, say, it's actually what we need at the time often. It's like, and so you can therefore read the Tao Te Ching for a lifetime and it will continue to serve you as a companion to help you navigate your life. And what you need today will be different from 10 years ago and 10 years in the future. And so then again, that's your wisdom. It's the intersection between the book, which is pointing to some wisdom, but then it's really your integration of what you need, which then makes some of the words stand out in certain ways.
Yeah. So let's get into Man of Tao here. That's in the Merton book. Real quick, what you were saying, I was thinking about the same exact thing. There's a movie from 1986 called Blue Velvet by David Lynch. And every time I watch Blue Velvet, I have a totally different take on it and a totally different meaning. New things jump out at me. So it's almost like I have to do my every 5-year viewing of Blue Velvet, and I laugh at different parts that I didn't before. So the Man of Tao. The man in whom Tao acts. Sorry, it's written a little strange. Let's see. The man in whom Tao acts without impediment, harms no other being by his actions, yet he does not know himself to be kind or gentle. The man in whom Tao acts without impediment, does not bother with his own interests, and does not despise others who do. He does not struggle to make money, and does not make a virtue of poverty. He goes his way, without relying on others, and does not pride himself on walking alone. While he does not follow the crowd, he won't complain of those who do. Rank and reward make no appeal to him. Disgrace and shame do not deter him. He is not always looking for right and wrong, always deciding yes or no. The ancients said, therefore, the man of Tao remains unknown. Perfect virtue produces nothing. No self is true self. And the greatest man is nobody. So that's a lot to unpack right there, George. What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is a really beautiful jumping off point for our exploration of Zhuangzi. And when we said at the start, freedom, like if that's something we can just drill in again and again of what Zhuangzi offers us. And for me, what stood out, and there's much we can break down in that, is the not needing to be anyone, and yet that not needing to be anyone is the source of a great potential. So that the closing lines of the man of Tao remains unknown. Perfect virtue produces nothing. No self is true self. And the greatest man is nobody. For me, that was so liberating when I started my journey when I was 21 and I'd just finished education, got confused and anxious over what I was doing with my life. Who was I? The good old classic stuff. And I was getting anxious and then beating myself up. A new character began to dominate my headspace. We talked about this baggage of all these different voices. I definitely have a motley crew in my psyche, which I think is realized now as part of this human embodiment. My inner critic I call the underminer, a little evil wizard. Hey, George, no friends, still single? You must be flawed goods. Oh, and now you're anxious. Look at everything you've got. You're pathetic. You're weak. So, yeah, just that was a difficult voice for me to live with, and I didn't know how to relate to it. And so even where, maybe normal self-development comes in as like affirmations, like, I am strong. I'm not weak. I am strong. I am powerful. And, we say every morning, like, I am strong. I'm whole. I actually think there's a space for that, and I think there is beauty in that. But it's also it's still affirming a story, an identity, a judgment. It's like, I am happy, as opposed to, and that removes an aspect of ourselves, the darkness, that then, okay, I'm not that.
Yeah.
And so then with this wisdom is that actually there's another option. Instead of either belittling ourselves and feeling terrible or trying to just pretend that everything's fine and aggrandize ourselves through affirmations, another option is available, which is to shed and to discard and to actually, as we begin to shed and shed and shed, come to a space where the stories disappear, the judgments disappear. We don't need to be anybody. We can just be. Nowhere to go, nothing to do, no one to be. And for me, that was such a liberation, this word freedom again, where, George, and like you said beautifully at the start, like the Western world has its place and all the philosophy has its place and thinking has its place, and George is a story that I need to navigate this world. And I also can let it all go, rest in the present moment. And there's so much freedom to be found there.
I think that's wonderful. And I think I had kind of a similar reaction to it. Maybe not a dramatic overnight feeling about shedding, but a gradual, I think as I'm getting older, I'm trying to shed more, I think. You were talking about the story we create, and here Chuang Tzu is talking about being nobody. There was a speaker I saw, Zen master Young Hoon Kim, who was Dr. Totten's Zen master, and he came to speak at the Taoist Institute a couple of years ago. And I was sitting there, and I was amazed by how wonderfully severe Zen Master Hoon was when someone was talking about the story of their life and how, everybody is telling their own story, the story of George. Everybody's, my name is Todd, and I'm making podcasts, and I'm trying to work harder to get to this point in life, and I want people to look at me as this type of person because I'm not that person, and I want to hide this type of person, I want to amplify this, or, whatever. And Zen Master Hoon just goes, no. There's no narrative. There is no story. You concocted all of this yourself. You took a bunch of random elements and strung them together. And he said it with just such confidence, and, that's why Dr. Totten said he was like a last returner. But I always go back to that and think about that. I go, how am I deceiving myself? And that I'm putting together some type of narrative, I found the beginning of this is very interesting because Chuang Tzu says that the man of Tao does not consider himself to be kind or gentle. And I think that, although does no harm to anyone, and that makes me think a lot about chapter 19 from the Tao Te Ching, where Lao Tzu talks about how goodness arises when Tao is lost. The idea that we start having to label things and put things in boxes when we separate ourselves from the Tao. It's like we have the one, and then it blows up into the 10,000 things, right? We have this kind of universal unity we have around us where we see everything is interconnected, and then we have the part of us that gets egoic and sees us as different. In the same way that when Tao is lost, when people are not on the path or on the way, that we have to start making distinctions in things, and we're not naturally just doing what's correct. We have to work towards specific behaviors. And so it's like that's a level of lesser abstraction when we start getting into having to create things like if everybody was cool that came over to your dinner, you wouldn't worry about things like manners. When you have a bunch of ragtag motley crew people, you know, all the people that live in George's Head, if they all came over for dinner, you'd have to have table manners and say, eat with that fork when you're having your salad, or you don't get up at this point, right? So in a more perfect, connected, Tao-centric world, you don't have to have these things. And I think that's a powerful thing, but that goes, again, into the idea of kind of being nothing. Not kind, not good, not rude, you know, but does no harm to anybody.
And it's so different from the dominant stories of the Western world and what goodness is like, you know, cliche 10 commandments, you know, like, this is what's good, this is what's bad. And even if we don't go to kind of the Old Testament, there is still this idea of what a righteous person looks like and what a bad person looks like. And you've got to follow these rules. Yeah, you've got to eat this certain way. You've got to get this sort of job. You've got to look at this, wear these clothes. And the Tao, you know, like each philosophy has a story of the fall from grace. It's like, why is life so hard? Like if we are children of God, or if we're manifestations of the forces of nature, if we come from the Tao, you know, whatever word you want to use for that, we are part of this great mystery called life in the universe. And if we are part of this great interconnected whole, how come life is so brimming tough, you know? What's happened?
Right.
And so, you know, each philosophy's got the story of what happened. And the Taoist story is words. You know, it's just like the Zhuangzi in another chapter said, well, before words, humans and the beasts, they were all hanging out, having loads of fun. And then words evolved and people started being good. You know, this idea. So like they started like having a definition, a concept of what goodness looks like, where previously it was an intuitive way of, you know, responding to community and to life in a way that felt harmonious without, the need for concepts. We had goodness and then we had righteousness. So, you know, identifying with that position. This is what righteousness is. You're not a good person. And then with that righteousness, deception. Where then we started to claim to be one way and then acted another. And this is the Confucian scholars, where Confucianism was the kind of the dominant culture when Taoism emerged, and the Taoists were writing in really opposition to, or maybe in complementary to, the dominant culture, where Zhuangzi saw so many people wearing the hats, wearing the nice robes, doing all the right walking and sitting in the mats straight and all of that good stuff, and yet deep inside were lying and manipulating people. And so they had the outward appearance and fulfilled the boxes of goodness, but actually that was deceptive. And so again, it's like people, the straw man Taoism, they say, well, it's not a moral philosophy, everything's relative. And actually that is a superficial understanding of really what these teachings are saying, because they're not saying just become a floppy mess that doesn't do anything and just, you know, like the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, so I'm just going to do nothing, and like nothing means anything. Yeah. It's like that's you know, where a lot of kind of hippie spiritual types, they like Taoism and that's their entryway into it. But in my understanding, that is only really the starting point. We break out of the concepts, understanding that they are words, that can be useful, but also can be blockages to actual harmony. And then we get to a place deeper within, where we find that integrity and that kindness and that gentleness that Zhuangzi says in this chapter, but without contriving to do so.
I love that. And I like how you're saying that, how when we start getting into the words and we start getting into describing and labeling things, it makes us more likely to be the victims of deception or deceptive, right? You know, again, I was talking earlier about this thing called the news going on. And a lot of people, there's always the story every day where the person who proclaims to be good and virtuous always has something going on in the closet. Oh no, and then they get caught, right? There's some other stuff in here that I really like, and it says that he does not struggle to make money and does not make a virtue of poverty, and without relying on others, and does not pride himself on walking alone. And there's a bit about not aggrandizing. You know, there's the idea of the virtuous poor person who has given up the world and everything, and it's almost like that's an identity, that's baggage, being that person that's now better than you because they are impoverished, or you know,
and poor you attached to all your material goods. I am an enlightened being, and yet that very non-attachment to to the material is in itself an attachment, or an identity and a story.
Yeah, and so he doesn't make any, you know, virtue out of it, and he doesn't struggle to make money, and I think that that is interesting in a certain way. It's like he doesn't struggle to make money either. He's not like striving to be rich, but also is not somebody who has to not use wu wei and end up working too hard in order to get by, right? You know, that's work smarter, not harder is almost could be a Taoist idea, but and also he's not the person. It's a personality flaw I found rather annoying with people, if I must say, is I worked so hard for this and I work hard, therefore blah blah blah. Yeah, well, you know, we all kind of work hard. I don't know that many people who don't. Well, I do know a couple people because I live in the greater Los Angeles area, and there's a lot of people with rich parents. But you know, but there's an idea that like, yeah, you don't need to be boastful about these things. And so, yeah, it kind of, again, it runs counter a bit to the spiritual idea of this virtuous spiritual person that's trying to get clout off it.
And on that, yeah, moderation. What I'm interested in, and I know that you know, our beautiful viewers and listeners have explored many different avenues into this world of understanding yourself and understanding the world. And moderation is a theme that comes out in many traditions around the world, because it's you know, the Buddha talks about this as well. You know, he was an ascetic, and gave everything up, starved himself, and then he found, well, actually, I'm attaching myself to having nothing. You know, and it's the great cosmic joke. There's paradoxes throughout all of this, and we've got to embrace them. And again, that's something that Eastern philosophy gives us, is that two things can be true at the same time. It's like both, yeah, you can get attached to the material world, and that can be painful when the world inevitably changes and you identify with you having more or less stuff that's outside of your control. So many traditions say, let it go. Find your center so that you can, yeah, flow with the inevitable changes of life. And yet, also then, if you get so caught up in allowing everything to just flow, and then you create a story around, I'm so skillful, just not resisting to anything, then suddenly, yeah, you have created a story, which in itself then is a blockage to freedom, and just this losing yourself again.
More about freedom, right? We keep going back to it. It's an interesting theme. So, George, do you have any practices that people can take a look at during the week, or things, any takeaways that people can have. We don't have a name for this segment, by the way, but at the end of each show I was like, George, if you can give people, as a Tai Chi instructor, as someone who teaches people breathing, as a Taoist philosopher, what's the takeaway here? What can people practice before they listen to the next show?
Yeah, we could freestyle a section for this. Do the Tao now is
Okay.
yeah, nice one. Or yeah, cheerio. I'm not sure. We'll think about that.
Doesn't cheerio, that's like goodbye, right? Like
Is it
cheerio.
goodbye? Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. We could work. Yeah, it's got to have the hesitation in it as well.
Yeah, we'll workshop it. I'll get some guys to work on it. We'll go to ChatGPT and find a name. Okay.
Yeah, we'll get our marketing team on that. Yeah, so practice is the path. Practice is the path. That's the key in the Taoist culture. So, say in Buddhism, you had the two general schools of thought. You had the gradual enlightenment school and you had the sudden enlightenment school. The gradual enlightenment says, you've got to meditate X hours a day and do all of your practices, and then you'll find freedom. And they battled, ironically, with the other school of thought. They were like, that's all a story. What? It takes a long time to realize that you're already whole. That's just a limiting belief. Just be whole now. And they have the stories of Zen masters smacking students around the head with a stick just to bash them out of their heads.
Oh yeah. Was it you? Were you talking about that on a recent video? I forget. Was it you or Dr. Todd? Somebody, I don't know, was telling me about the Zen masters hitting people with switches. We don't do that here, but
No, we don't. The legal bills would be too much in the modern world. We would do otherwise.
Yeah.
And so, for the Taoist culture, practice is the path. And so, this is the empowering bit about the practice, is that all the ideas are great and help us integrate, understand what it means to be a human and the experiences that we have. And the Taoist culture, over hundreds of years, has developed all these wonderful practices to help us keep that insight alive. That's the key bit. So we have breakthroughs and insights when we listen to podcasts and go on retreats or courses and maybe have some revelations. How do we keep that alive in our day-to-day practice? So that's just one thing to keep stressing. Practice is the path. And then if I could offer a small thing for all of you beautiful listeners and viewers, and this has been so supportive for me, and we can continue to get deeper with this, is the breath. And yeah, I think it is an appropriate place to start. Qi, the word that you'll know, you might not know, has two meanings. Most people associate it with energy, so qi, energy, but it also has a simultaneous meaning of the breath. So that's pretty fascinating. The same word for the energy that powers the whole universe is also the same word as the breath. And that speaks to the intuition, and again, this is an intuition found across the world, that there is a lot of learning and depth that can be found from the breath.
Okay.
So we can get deeper into some breath work in coming sessions, but if I was to give you just one little tool, is the single breath. And this is a practice that I do throughout the day. It's the meditation I do the most throughout the day, which is just one breath. And I would invite beautiful listeners to just try one or two with me now if you'd like to. So if you'd like to join, I invite you to breathe in, to soften your face, and to breathe out. A nice long exhale through the nose. And one more, breathing in and breathing out. And that's it. See that little beautiful pattern break, just to slow down, to come back into presence, back into your body. And yeah, if you can bring that into today, the rest of your day, that's a beautiful tool for you to use. And I'd love to know your thoughts on how that landed for you.
It's interesting. When you said relax your face, I was then going back to what we were just reading about being like the no thing or the man being nothing. And I immediately, when you said relax your face, socially, for for me to relax my face meant that I was now not in control of how I was presenting myself, and that made me slightly uncomfortable. And that's a lesson, right?
Beautiful. Yeah, and that beautiful that, you know, that is the lesson. And it's often it's the resistance and what comes up when we try things that are new or different, that's where the real growth is. And so, yeah, and speaking to, you know, the softening and the relaxing, and Chuang Tzu again talks about how when a belt's comfortable, you can't feel the belt.
Yeah.
When a pair of shoes is comfortable, you don't feel the shoes. And life can be like that as well. It's like when we're comfortable in ourselves, we don't notice ourselves. We don't really even remember that we have a self. And so how do we get there? It's relaxation. And here's the paradox again, is that, okay, even me saying relax your face is maybe something that can create tension, because suddenly we're consciously, I need to relax my face now. But then it's the paradox of the words point to something for us to do, and then we can soften. And so over time, those sort of pointers and practices, they can eventually get to an intuitive place where the softening does happen without it being forced or contrived, but the words point to getting there. It's ultimately letting go that really is the final product.